All right, welcome back to program number 2 in our accelerated NLP training series. And now as we get into the heart of the matter, I'd like you to begin to think about something. So let's look at page 7. And if you look at our little man here, what we've got is an external event that comes in from the outside. And it goes into his head and he filters that information in some way. So write the word do right there next to delete, distort, and generalize on page 7. The filters do the process of deleting, distorting, and generalizing. And the filters are our experience of time, space, matter, and energy, our language, the language that we speak. And those of you that are multilingual know that when you're thinking in your different language, that the world is a different place. Our memories and decisions, those also filter our external experience. And metaprograms and values and beliefs and attitudes. Those all filter our experience, and then that experience comes inside and we make an internal representation of it. That internal representation is intimately coupled with a state, and that state is intimately coupled with a physiology, which you'll notice it says leads to behavior. Now what I'd like you to do on page 7 is I'd like you to take and make a circle around the part that says internal representation, because that's real important for NLP as well as for any communication that we do. I'd like you to begin by noticing the kinds of words that you use and the kinds of words that people around you use. I'd like you to begin to notice what's the internal representation that you make inside your head. I'd like you to think about what is the order and sequence of those internal representations. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm not just talking about positive thinking. 20 years ago, they did a study of the major industrial accidents in the United States, and they found that there was a poster on the wall in the majority of those cases that told the person what not to do. You've seen them. You've seen them. In fact, my favorite one is the one that's required, which is a guy with a banana peel. And I've seen this so many times, I can't believe it. And there's a guy with a banana peel, and he's slipping, and the banana peel's going up in the air, and he's falling over backwards. And underneath in big letters, it says, "Don't slip." Now, I think it makes a lot of sense to tell people what to do, but I'm not sure if it makes a lot of sense to tell people what not to do. And the reason is because your mind cannot process a negative directly. For example, if I were to say to you, don't think of a blue tree, just for a minute, stop, and notice what happens if I say to you, don't think of a blue tree. Well, what are you thinking of? Probably you're thinking of a blue tree unless you've been semantically trained. It's impossible to not think about something you're not supposed to think about. In fact, you can't actually do that. So as you consider this entire training, I'd like you to consider it in light of what is the internal representation that goes on inside your head. This is the basis of creating change. This internal representation that's here on the left side of our diagram on page 7. Notice it's impossible to hold a negative in consciousness directly. Now, if I were to say to you, don't think of a blue tree, you might think of a blue tree and then think, oh, I'm not supposed to think of a blue tree, so then you'd think of a tree with green leaves. That's one possibility. So at very best, it might be a two-step process where you think about what you don't want to think about, then you think about what you do want to think about. Think about that for a moment and realize that it's not possible to think about what you don't want to think about without thinking about it. Now, here's the thing. Your nervous system, the human body and the human nervous system is an exquisite device. You've been given a device that is so efficient for producing behavior. But the behavior that it produces depends upon the internal representation that you make. And if you're making an internal representation that is about what you don't want, then you're likely to produce behavior that also is what you don't want. Think about kids, for example. You have a kid, and you say to him, "Don't go play in the street," and he goes, "Oh, the street! Thanks, Dad. I never thought of that." And off he goes. Or it's Christmas time, and you put a bowl of nuts on the table, and you say, "Keep your hands off those nuts," and he says, "Okay," as he grabs for him, because you've put something in his mind that perhaps wasn't even there. Now, this NLP communication model is very important in terms of our communication, and actually, page 7 contains just about all of NLP with some additions that we'll make shortly. So I'd like to begin by thinking about that. What is it that I have to do to change this internal representation? And that's what NLP at the practitioner level is about, and that's what we'll be talking about in these programs that you're going to be listening to. Let's see where NLP came from. I think that's important to begin with as we begin to talk about this sort of science of NLP. Where did it come from? What's the thinking? I'd like to talk to you a little bit about those early on days when NLP wasn't even around. So if you look at page 4A, that's titled The History of NLP. And you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner, a guy named Alfred Korzybski in 1933. Korzybski wrote a book called Science and Sanity, and it was a general semantics book. And in Science and Sanity, Korzybski said something really interesting. He said that almost all psychological problems were the result of the inability of a person to traverse logical levels. Well, that's interesting and one of the other things he said was that probably sometime in the future there would be a wholly processed description of a human being that would come along and actually describe a human being. Well, of course, that's NLP. If you look at Václavic, Paul Václavic was a linguistics professor in the 1950s. He sort of added to the beginnings of NLP, or the pre-beginnings of NLP, before it was even a thought. Gregory Bateson and Jay Haley had a great debate about ecology, which gave us some thoughts about ecology. And down at the bottom of the left-hand side, Fritz Perls was into Gestalt therapy. And I think Fritz was probably the guy that was the inspiration, along with Bateson, for kicking off this science that became NLP. Because around 1975, Richard Bandler was a student at Santa Cruz University, and John Grinder was a linguistics professor. And Bandler was into computers and Gestalt therapy. And Bandler happened to be editing a book about Fritz Perls. And Richard decided that he could actually do Gestalt therapy. And so he began to do it, and he was actually very, very good at it. And as Richard began to move forward and use the things he'd learned, Richard realized that he had a specific gift of modeling. Being able to actually take what worked that someone was doing and use it and create something out of it. This is where the notion of NLP being an attitude and a methodology comes from. It comes from that idea of actually being able to look and see what is excellent behavior and how is that excellent behavior produced. And then looking across at the person and seeing that most excellent behavior, and then how do I take that behavior, which is really good that that other person is doing, and how do I try that on myself? How do I put it on myself and be able to use it for myself so that I can then create that good behavior myself? And so NLP begins as an attitude and a methodology that leaves behind a trail of techniques. The rest of the people on this chart were people essentially that were modeled. The three major people that were modeled were Milton Erickson, as you probably know, and Virginia Satir, and Fritz Perls, and these people were actually modeled by Richard Bandler and John Grinder in the early days of NLP in terms of how do you create magical change in people? What is it that makes a difference? What is it that makes a difference, and how can you, simply by using the words that you use, make a change? A lot of what NLP is about is being able to create that kind of magical change. It begins with an attitude of curiosity. It's kind of like wanting to know what's going on behind what's going on. I don't know if you can remember when you were a kid, but the first time for me that I wanted to know what was going on behind what was going on was I saw an electric clock. Or it might have been a clock that ticked, who knows. But it was up on the kitchen wall, you know. And I looked up there, and the second hand was going around, and to me, that was like so magical. So one day I actually went in and took the clock apart. Mom was outside, and I climbed up on the kitchen counter and took the clock down off the wall and began, I think I probably unplugged it, at least I hope I did, and began to look inside the clock to see what's going on in here. What's going on inside this clock? What is it that makes it tick? What is it that, and so that attitude of curiosity is extremely important in NLP. It's like, what is it that makes this work? When we look at a human being, it's not that we think that human beings or individuals are broken or even evil or dirty or nasty. We look at, with each human being, we look at each human being with wonderment. And we ask ourselves, wow, how is it possible that this person in this circumstances could produce this behavior? Now, the second thing, which might be equally as important as curiosity, is, of course, a willingness to experiment. A willingness to try something new to see if it's going to work. And in part, that's what NLP is about. It's about this attitude. In fact, NLP is based in part on Milton Erickson's work, and you'll find Erickson there on the top of page 4A, and it mentions him in terms of hypnosis. Milton Erickson was, until his death in 1980, the world's foremost hypnotherapist. I think Erickson probably single-handedly was responsible for taking hypnosis off of the stage and taking it out of the Dark Ages and moving it into a respectable practice that would actually create change in people. You know, prior to Erickson, hypnosis was a lot about stage show hypnotists, and it was also a lot about one person's power over another person. And Erickson came along and decided that it was something that could be used by a medical doctor. And I don't know if you know this, but in 1954, the American Medical Association tried to disbar Erickson. They actually went to him and said, "You're practicing hypnosis, so we're going to take away your medical license." And by 1957, he had convinced the American Medical Association that hypnosis was legitimate. And by 1958, they came out with a statement that said, hypnosis was a legitimate form of treatment when conscientiously applied by a practitioner who had been appropriately trained in hypnosis. And Erickson actually worked and practiced hypnosis regularly from 1920 until 1980. Now, the way I've got it figured, if I saw 6 or 7 people a day for 60 years, I'd get pretty good at it. And so Erickson discovered a lot of stuff, and we're going to be going over a lot of what Erickson's discoveries were in this training. Erickson was incredibly curious. In fact, one day Erickson was walking down the street where he lived. He heard a noise coming from across the street, and he looked up and he saw this sign, and the sign said, "So-and-so Boiler Factory." I don't know the name of the factory, but it was a boiler factory where they make boilers, you know. And in those days, they made boilers to heat the hotels or the large buildings. I guess maybe they still do. Maybe you could imagine the boiler the size of this room, with plates of steel coming around like this, and maybe it would be each plate of steel would be 1 inch thick or maybe 2 inches thick, and then making a seam at the top with rivets along the top. Maybe 1 rivet every 2 feet, or 2 rivets every 18 inches, or maybe 3 rivets every 24 inches along the top of the boiler, and then around the sides a seam there too, riveting it in. And Erickson, being kind of curious, said, "I think there's something to learn here. I think there's something to learn inside the boiler factory." So he went inside the boiler factory, and when he got inside, he looked around and noticed that there were workers inside. And they were going back and forth, doing whatever they did quite purposefully. He noticed the light changed, and he couldn't see anything really in the beginning, but then he saw the workers and noticed they were communicating with each other. But he couldn't hear them inside. So he figured there's got to be something to learn here, because they're communicating, and I'm not hearing them inside. So he stopped one of the workers and he said, "Can you get me the boss? I want you to ask the boss to come outside because we need to have a chat." So the boss came outside, and Erickson said, "I'm learning about how to communicate, and I'm really interested in that. And I'm wondering if I could sleep here for the evening." And the boss thought, "Whoa, that's a rather unusual request. I don't know if I've ever had a request like that before," but Erickson seemed rather sincere, and so the boss said, "Okay, you can sleep here for the rest of the time." So Erickson went home and he got his pillow and his blanket and came back to the boiler factory, and once again as he stood outside, he could still hear the tremendous noise. And he crossed the street again and he went inside the boiler factory, and there's just a tremendous amount of noise, and as the light changed behind him, the door closed. And the light changed. And then it took him a few moments for his eyes to become accustomed to the light, and then the noise. And as he did, as he looked around and noticed the noise, he also noticed the workers, and he saw that they were communicating with each other, but he still couldn't hear them. Even after he laid down, he said the noise was horrendous because the men were jackhammering rivets into the sheets of steel, and the sheets of steel rolling out of the places where they come from, and all this noise. And he said he found a place out of the way, not out of the noise, but sort of out of the way where he wouldn't get run over or anything, And he laid out his pillow and his blanket, and he said, long about midnight, he said, "I just managed to take all of that noise and put it outside of my head." And he said, then he managed to fall asleep. Erickson was quite curious in that way. Very, very curious. And one of the things that Erickson used to do, quite frankly, is he used to put himself in situations where he would have to learn something by putting himself in that situation. You know, one of the things we've discovered since Erickson is putting yourself in situations where you have to learn from the situation really increases the amount of dendrites in your brain, really increases your neurological connections inside your brain, really increases your ability of your brain to process information. One of the main things for him was to always, always, always be in a learning state. And he was, quite frankly, willing to experiment. So how do we go about in NLP? How do we go about finding this trail of techniques with that kind of experimentation and that kind of attitude? And the methodology that we use in NLP is called modeling. Now, we're not actually going to fully cover modeling in the practitioner training because, quite frankly, it's a master practitioner, part of the master practitioner training. We'll be covering that on the master practitioner tape set. We will talk a little bit about modeling, and modeling is the technology by which the trail of techniques was created. So NLP is an attitude and a methodology that leaves behind the trail of techniques. However, giving you a technique is kind of like giving you a fish. And to be frank with you, my intent would be to give you a change inside of yourself, not just give you the techniques, because quite frankly, any NLP trainer can teach you how to do techniques. What I'd like to do together is for us to work on changing your attitude and changing how you think. Because if together we can change how you think, you're not here because I learned how to do a bunch of techniques. You're not listening to this series because I learned a bunch of techniques. What you're here for is the change in thinking and the change in attitude that goes along with this. So with your permission, if we haven't already, I'd like to begin to communicate directly to your unconscious mind from time to time and to give you suggestions which will make a difference at the conscious level and at the unconscious level. And I'd like to make those suggestions such that when you finish listening to this series of tapes, that you will have the changes that you began and that you desired in the beginning when you set your outcome. And see, that was really what Milton Erickson was all about. Here we digress. So let's go back and talk about, we're still on page 4A, the history of NLP. Let's talk for a moment about Virginia Satir. Now, Virginia was into family therapy. Virginia was the grande dame of family therapy. And just very, very well known and as a great magician. Families would come to her and she would just sort of magically straighten things out for them. Amazing. She would just sort of have a chat with them and people would walk away and they would just feel so much better. Then Bandler and Grinder decided that they could certainly find out what she did. And John and Richard actually spent some time studying Virginia Satir. In fact, Virginia had already written several books, and Bandler and Grinder wrote one book with Virginia Satir prior to producing what they called NLP. The name of that book is called Changing with Families, and it's still in print. Most of what we know as the meta model was already being done by Virginia Satir as one of her techniques in family therapy. And what she did was she just got more specific. That is to say, if somebody came to her and said, "He hurt me," she would say, "How specifically?" And all of a sudden, as if by magic, the problem would seem to disappear, at least according to John and Richard. So they decided that the way to cause change with people was to become more specific. And out of Virginia Satir's work, they created something called the meta model, which means over model. It means a model of grammar. It actually relates to the entire linguistic model of grammar. Now, they'd finished modeling Virginia and decided that one of the ways that you would change people is to get more specific, and then off they went to model Milton Erickson. Whoa. They discovered that Erickson was producing miraculous change, just as miraculous as Virginia Satir was producing, but he was doing it by being artfully vague. Oops. So what they thought was, originally they thought, well, let's get more specific, and that creates change, and then they decided, well, here's another range in that spectrum, and so they created the Milton model, or hypnotic language patterns. Now, up to this point, we're talking about roughly 1979 or 1980, they'd published about 4 books. The Structure of Magic, volumes 1 and 2, and The Patterns of Milton H. Erickson, MD, volumes 1 and 2. And at this point, we're just beginning the work on representational systems. But NLP was not really very well known until they began to include the work of Pavlov and noticing the process of anchoring. Now, the notion of anchoring is simply the process of stimulus response, and it comes from Pavlov. Pavlov published his first book, Conditioned Reflexes, around 1930. The notion of stimulus response was not created by Pavlov. In fact, here's a little known fact. In 1902, a guy by the name of Twittmeyer made a presentation to the American Medical Association. And Twittmeyer said, every time I hit my patient on the knee, their knee moves. He said it's called the knee-jerk reflex, and that was actually written up in 1902 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Twittmeyer also noticed, and he said in this article, that if he told the patients he was about to hit their knee before he hit it, that he could actually get the knee to jerk without hitting the knee. The American Medical Association didn't notice this, but I believe that Ivan Pavlov read that and began his work in 1904. By 1904, he had actually made a presentation to the Russian Medical Society called Stimulus Response and Conditioned Reflexes. And the Russian Medical Society and Pavlov began to work on that, which ultimately became behavioral psychology. And anchoring is based on that notion. The notion of anchoring in NLP, where we actually capture a stimulus and apply an anchor at the same time as the person is in a modified state, is actually directly from Pavlov's work in behavioral psychology. Now, Bandler and Grinder are off and running, and Frogs into Princes is the next major book published in 1979. It talks essentially about changing personal history, and also the first time that eye patterns were published. Eye patterns were also published in a book written by Cybervision in 1979, so there are actually two works on eye patterns published simultaneously in the same year. I'm not sure which one came first, but both of those books on eye patterns were published at the same time, and the Cybervision eye patterns don't necessarily agree with the NLP eye patterns. But personally, I've used the NLP eye patterns for quite a while now, and they seem to work very well. Those were all published in Frogs into Princes, where they also talked a little bit about changed personal history, which I think would have an effect on timeline therapy. The next book was Strategies, and the name of the book was NLP Volume 1. Robert Dilts joins in now. It's actually Bandler, Grinder, Dilts, Delosier, and Leslie Cameron Bandler, who wrote the book called NLP Volume 1. And in there, they included information from Miller, Galanter, and Pribram, which is just above to the right there, about the tote model. And the tote model was an attempt by Miller, Galanter, and Pribram to explain complex behaviors, which follows an anchor. This, of course, follows on the work of Pavlov. And Miller, Galanter, and Pribram decided to explain how complex behaviors took place rather than simple behaviors. They published their work in 1960 in a book called Plans and the Structure of Behavior. NLP actually has expanded on Pribram's work. Now, next, Bandler and Grinder rewrote their work, Patterns, Volumes 1 and 2, and called it Transformations. They actually took a transcript of a seminar that they did in 1982, and along with the Patterns 1 and 2, wrote it in a more readable form, I think, and something which is more usable for most people. Transformations was written in 1982 and well worth reading. Also, the book Reframing came out at the same time, and that mostly comes from Milton Erickson's work, also published around 1982. And then for all practical purposes, it began to seem like nothing was going on in NLP. Richard and John actually broke up, and Richard and Leslie got a divorce, and Richard Bandler jumped on the plane and went to Kona, Hawaii, and he hung out there for a couple of years, and people thought nothing was going on in NLP. However, it seemed like Richard was really off doing something else, because in 1985 he wrote the book Using Your Brain for a Change. He'd already written Magic in Action, which is right underneath there, and still is a sleeper. I think it's one of the more important books in NLP. And in 1988, Wyatt Woodsmall and I published Timeline Therapy and the Basis of Personality, which has proven to be a very important book for timeline therapy, especially and for NLP, because what it does is it adds in the temporal aspect, and we'll be talking a little bit about that as we move along. So NLP is actually quite a respectable body of knowledge that has a background in a number of intellectual disciplines. NLP, according to our model here, seems to have drawn on general semantics, on linguistics, on hypnosis, on Gestalt therapy. It takes into account ecology and family therapy and metaphors. And so really becomes a study of what works. It really is a study of how do you produce results. What kind of results do you want to produce? And how would you produce results in any one of three areas? In business, in education, and in therapy. Now let's define NLP before we go any further. And why don't you take and turn to page 6 in your notebook. Page 6, which is a definition of NLP. Now, our definition of NLP, and this is the traditional definition, it essentially takes the three words, and let's look at each of the three words. Neuro relates to the nervous system, which is the mind, and through which our experience is processed by way of the five senses, which are visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, and gustatory. Linguistic relates to language and other nonverbal communication systems through which our neural network representations are coded and ordered and given meaning. And this includes pictures, sounds and feelings, taste and smells, and the words we use, which are the self-talk. Now, programming relates to the ability to discover and utilize the programs that we run inside ourselves, the things we do inside our heads, and also that others do, so that we can achieve our own specific and desired outcomes. In other words, NLP is how do you use the language of the mind to consistently achieve our specific and desired outcomes. NLP is really the study of excellence. How do we discover excellence wherever it is and then utilize that in such a way that we can create change in ourselves and others? With all that in mind, what I'd like to do now is go back to page 7, and let's look at that internal representation again, because that probably seems to be real key. The question is, how do we make sure that that internal representation produces the kind of state and the kind of physiology that we want, which produces the kind of behavior that we want? How are we then sure that all of those are working together? And let's look at page 8. So if we go to page 8, what we'll notice is the 5 principles for success. These are real important in terms of NLP. Prior to NLP, many therapists, actually it was prior to Milton Erickson, many therapists really didn't have an outcome for doing therapy. I don't know if you're familiar with the Rogerian style of therapy, but it was essentially outcome-less therapy, where the client might say, I'm upset, and the therapist would mirror back to the client saying, I hear you saying you're upset. And that, in essence, was supposed to change the client in some way. Well, it actually didn't. And Erickson was one of the first people to say to the people who were his contemporaries, look, I think you ought to have an outcome. When you're doing something, you probably ought to have an outcome or an idea of what it is that you're doing. Well, from an NLP point of view, we always want to know our outcome. Whenever we're doing NLP, it's probably a really, really good idea to have a clear idea of what it is that you want to accomplish. And then to take action. Number 2 is to take action. Obviously, if you have an idea but you don't do anything about it, nothing's going to happen. Then the third thing is to have sensory acuity. And we're going to talk in future programs about having sensory acuity. How do you look at someone else and notice what kind of things are going on inside them? There's a real powerful set of techniques in NLP for paying attention to other people, and we're going to talk about that in our sensory acuity section. Next is to have some behavioral flexibility. I remember, for me, when I was in sales, if somebody wasn't listening to me, I used to talk louder and faster. And I'm from upstate New York, and I can talk pretty loud and pretty fast. And that didn't work very well. So I noticed with NLP that people were behaving differently than I was, and having that sort of behavioral flexibility, being able to make changes in your own state and your own behavior from moment to moment, is going to probably assist you in getting your outcome. And then number 5, to operate from a physiology and psychology of excellence is also very important. How do you hold yourself? How do you stand? What kind of thoughts are going on in your head? Those kinds of things create the physiology and psychology of excellence, which essentially says, think about what it is you want. Pay attention to what it is that you want in your head, and make sure that the way you're standing, the physiology that you're in, is a very powerful, positive physiology. And that will assist you in producing the kind of results you want. Now, the very first thing we've got to do is to know our outcome. And I had a business consulting friend once who, when he'd go and talk to clients, he would say, there are some really important things that we need to do as we move into the next century for being able to look at how do we make a business work. And he said one of the things that was really, really important was to know where it is you wanted to go. He recommended a business plan. Well, in the case of an individual, that business plan simply becomes, what is it that you want to accomplish? What are we trying to accomplish here? What is it that you want to do? And so I'm going to ask you actually right now to take a moment and write down what it is that you want to accomplish. You could write those down right here, opposite on the back of page 8 if you wanted to. And in fact, that would be a good place because we're going to look at page 9 in relationship to what you've written down. So I think what we ought to do is just take a few minutes, and I think probably just about 7 minutes, to go ahead and write down your goals and your outcomes for becoming a practitioner of NLP. So just go ahead and write, and I'll time you, and you can just let the program play on while you do. And we'll put on some, I think this is really good music to set goals by. For some of you, this may sound somewhat familiar. If you haven't finished by the time we get to this point, you can just go ahead and press pause on your player while you finish writing your goals. But that's been about 7 minutes. And what I'd like to do, if you're done, is let's just take a look at page 9. Because sometimes people write things and it's not exactly what it is that you want. So the next few pages, actually pages 9, 10, and 11, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over with you some of the principles for how do you create this internal representation inside of your head. And the first thing I want to talk about is a state versus goal. Now, sometimes people write goals that include states. So when I accomplish X, I will be happy. Now I think that's fine, but here's a problem. The issue of happiness from an NLP point of view is it's a state. Now, since it's a state, we can have it immediately. All you have to do is remember a time when you were happy. In fact, if you'd like to do this with me, why don't you just stop for a moment and remember a time when you were totally happy. Just go back and remember a specific time. As you go back to that time, float down into your body, see what you saw, hear what you heard, and feel the feelings of being totally happy. Do you remember that? Now, how do you feel? So here's the thing about writing a goal that includes a state in it. If you put something in the future, like 6 months from now, I'll be happy, the problem from an NLP point of view is that you could be happy right now. So if you look at page 9, a value or a state is stated ambiguously, whereas a goal or an outcome is usually stated specifically. We used to write affirmations to create states or to create values. By the way, we don't do that anymore because, as we'll see as we go through this program series, you probably won't have to write another affirmation if you've been into those regularly. I, by the way, used to be into affirmations, and I think I repeated Catherine Ponder's Everything and Everybody Prospers Me Now, and I Prosper Everybody and Everything for 2 years. And then finally I realized with NLP we can do that in just a moment. So we'll show you how to do that. And we'd write goals or outcomes if we're doing a goal or outcome. You can have a value or a state now, and with a goal or an outcome, time is involved. See, there's a difference, for example, between confidence and competence. I can be real confident by remembering a time when I was totally confident. However, if I'm working on something like learning brain surgery, for example, I could be real confident, and if I'd never taken any surgery classes, I don't think that you probably would want me working on your head. So time is involved in the process of getting a goal or an outcome. With a value or state, there are no steps, and there are steps needed to get to a goal or an outcome. And actually, one way is to get the final step and then work backwards. A value or state is infinite, or it's not really measurable, whereas a goal or an outcome is measurable. And a value or state can be stated for self and or others, and generally a goal or an outcome is stated for self only. Let's go over and look at page 10. So as you've written the outcomes that you've written, what I'd like you to do just for fun, because we're going to go over the keys to an achievable outcome, and I, for a moment, go over one of the goals that you picked. So take a moment, think about this, and pick one of the goals. Like, which one of them is the most important? Or which one of them, if you accomplish this goal, would this be the most important training that you'd ever taken? Or the most important series of programs that you'd ever listened to? Okay, got it? Good. If you haven't, then go ahead and stop or press pause until you do. Okay. Now, let me ask you some questions about this, and I'd like you to notice what happens inside you as you fully consider each of the questions that I'm going to ask you. So the first question I'd like to ask is, what specifically do you want to have happen? What specifically do you want to have happen by creating this outcome for yourself? And you can think about that. Now, the next question is, where are you now? Compared to what specifically you want, where are you now? Okay. And what will you see, hear, and feel when you have accomplished this outcome? So think about that. Think about that. And then the next one is, how will you know when you have it? This is really, really important. How will you know when you've accomplished what you want to accomplish from listening to this tape set? Like what's going to happen that when it happens, you absolutely go, yes, I got it. Now, the next question is, what will this outcome get for you, or what will it allow you to do? Is this only for you? So think about that. Is this only for you, or are there other people involved that you're doing this for also? I think, by the way, if I could make a comment here, I think it's important for you to want it primarily for you. I think it's okay to have it with other people, but I think also you're going to be the person that has to get it, so you're going to have to do this. And then the next question is, where, when, and how, and with whom do you want it? So notice, who is it going to be with? Where will you be? When is it going to happen? How is it going to happen? Good. And next, what do you have now? And what do you need to get your outcome? Think about that for a moment. What do you have now, and what do you need? What will you need in order to be able to get this outcome? When you ask that question, what do you need to get your outcome? If you're ever in a situation where you find you don't have everything you need, you could ask yourself the following 3 questions underneath. Have you ever had or done this before? Do you know anyone else who has? And if you haven't, can you act as if you already have accomplished that? Okay, good. And then the final question is, for what purpose do you want this? What will you gain or lose if you have it? These are all questions that as we begin an NLP session, let's say we're doing therapy, or if we're doing business consulting using NLP, or let's say that we're working with a kid in education, we're helping the child to get better grades, or let's say we're using it in a business setting. No matter what setting we're using it in, when we begin our NLP session, we're going to want to ask some of these questions. By the way, the bottom 4 questions under number 9 at the very bottom of the page, those are questions that we'll talk about during your actual practitioner training. When you come and take the training with us, we'll talk about those last 4 questions. They're also very important, but they're used somewhat differently. Now let's go on to page 11. So here's the thing. Anytime you set a goal, from an NLP point of view, that goal needs to be set in a way that it is well-formed. Essentially, the goal should be stated in positive terms. And we didn't cover this before you wrote your goals. By the way, you may want to go back and rewrite your goals. If not all of your goals were stated in positive terms, you may want to go back and rewrite them. The second thing is the goal initiated and maintained by the client? Is it something that it begins with you, that you can maintain it, and that you can complete it? I mean, probably you're going to be working with some other people, obviously. But are you sufficiently in charge of that? Number 3, specific sensory-based description of the outcome and the steps needed to get there. So what is the outcome? In other words, as we said on page 10, what will you see, hear, and feel when you have it? And I think number 3 here also includes the steps needed to get there. So what is it you need to do to get to that place? What will you need to do to get to that place? Number 4, is it ecological? I think personally that there are 4 levels to ecology. And the way I like to think of ecology is this. It seems to me that something is ecological if it works for you. So the question you could ask yourself for ecology is, what will happen to me if I accomplish this? If there are some things that might happen to you or that could happen to you that you're not happy with, you're not going to be as congruent about getting the outcome. Let me define that word congruent. Congruent means that all of your systems are go with regards to that outcome. In other words, it means that you don't have any little niggling doubts, little self-talk inside your head that says, oh, but you can't have that, or oh, you shouldn't have that, or this or that. So congruent means I am totally aligned inside myself, that all your IRs, all the internal representations say go. Everything says go. And that's for yourself. Now, the next thing is we need to begin to look outside ourselves, because ecology is not just the study of what's up with us. Ecology is also the study of, hey, what's going to happen with the rest of the people in my life? So we probably ought to look at, in addition to self, what's going to happen to the people around us. And the people around us, if you're setting a business goal, the people around us are the people in your business or the people in your category or your career in that area. Or it's your family. What's going to happen to your family, the people you love, the people you live with? What's going to happen to them if you get this goal? Then the next level of ecology is societal. Like, what's going to happen to the society if I get this goal? And of course, this will put us into the question of, is what I'm going to do legal, ethical, and moral? And of course, those are all issues which probably it would be a good idea to pay attention to, to pay attention to before you actually get to the point of having to pay attention to them. And then the final part of ecology, for me, and this is just me, I think that we should be paying attention to the planet today. So the fourth level of ecology for me is if I get this goal, is it good for the planet? Now, not a lot of people have paid enough attention to that, in my opinion. So I think when you're setting an outcome or setting goals, that you should pay attention to all of those. Number 5, that there's more than one way to get the outcome. I think that you should pay attention to having other ways to get the outcome than simply one way. Number 6, that the first step is specified and it's achievable. And finally, number 7, does it increase choice? An outcome which decreases our choice is not really well specified. The problem with having an outcome that decreases choice is that it's something that is not well formed, in the sense that it doesn't make it really easy to achieve that goal. Now let's go back to page 7. If you turn to page 7 in your notebook, all of these things that we've just talked about, the 5 principles for success, the keys to an achievable outcome, and the well-formed conditions, are the basis for our internal representations, and having them be so that they produce the best behavior possible. That's one of the secrets of NLP. If we can be in charge of our internal representation, which allows us to be in charge of our state, which allows us to be in charge of our physiology, if all of these are under control, then the behavior that we're going to produce is going to be the most effective, the most efficient, and probably is going to produce the best results. And that's what the NLP Communication Model is all about. How do we produce the best possible results that we can, the kind of results that we want to create? Now, let me show you how this works in your own life and in my life. When we were doing business consulting, we would run into client after client that really had no direction, no goals, no idea where they were going. The problem with that is that when you don't have any idea where you're going, you'll begin to produce behavior that is sort of undirected. I think I used to use the analogy of the ship. If you and I were going to get on a ship together, and we were going to go sail out in the ocean, and you'd say to me, Tad, where are we going? And I'd say, well, I don't really know. Not only do I not have any idea where we're going, but we've disconnected the rudder, and we're just going to float to where we float. Now, quite frankly, in Hawaii, surfers are famous for doing this all the time. A lot of times people will get on and they call it the Tahiti Express, and quite frankly, if you catch one of the currents, you're likely to go to Tahiti, which is okay if that's where you want to go. But many people without a goal or without an idea of where they want to go will produce behavior and produce a direction which is not directed. And so they'll end up wherever they do. One of our clients for years and years had worked without goals, and he actually resisted setting goals. And he said, no, I really don't want to set a goal. I really don't want to have an outcome. I really don't want to be clear about where I'm going. And he resisted it for a number of reasons, which, when we finally reframed it, he began to realize that, yeah, it might be a good idea to set some goals. So he did. Now, in my own personal experience, we used to own a radio station in Honolulu. And while we were owning the radio station, we were actually losing money. In fact, I think for the first 3 years that we owned the radio station, we lost about $300,000. And one day the IRS came into my office and he flipped out his badge and he said, Mr. James, you're in big trouble. And the bank called that day and called $150,000 worth of loans that we had. And I went, whoa. Now, step back from this for a moment and let me tell you about my buddy Mark. My buddy Mark used to call me every year. For the first 3 years that we owned the radio station, Mark called me. He never told me this, thanks a lot, Mark, until the fourth year. But the first year he called me and he said, how's it going? And I said, oh, we're doing just great. We're almost up to our projection and we're going to break even next month. And then he called me the next year. And he said, how are you doing? And I said, oh, we're almost up to our projection and we're going to break even next month. And then he called me the next year and he said, how's it going? And I said, well, we're almost up to our projection and we're going to break even next month. Well, notice the pattern there. I had been saying to myself, we're going to break even. By the way, I didn't even say we're going to make money. I said, we're going to break even next month. And quite frankly, that cost me about $300,000. I'll save you $300,000 if you set your goals appropriately. So your goal ought to contain an idea of what it is you want to accomplish from the end state. An idea of what it is that you want to accomplish. What is it that you're looking for in terms of your own personal accomplishment of this goal? What will that goal look like? What will it sound like? What will it feel like? And I mean specifically. I mean very, very specifically. So the way this all works together is if you're specific about your goals, and your goals meet all the criteria that we've just outlined. If they're specifically enough stated so that you know when you got them. Sometimes people write a goal of, oh, I want to be happy. Or, oh, wouldn't it be a great idea if this happened? Or as I said, wouldn't it be a great idea if we broke even? But specifically, that's not the solution, because just breaking even doesn't mean you make any money to pay back your previous debts. And why not make a little money? And specifically in terms of writing a goal for income would be written in the present tense. And the goal should be a description of the end state of which you hope to accomplish. You don't want to write a goal of, I want to make X amount of dollars more money. The way you write the goal is, I now make, so written in present tense, and it's an end state description of what it is you hope to accomplish. With that, your goal setting ought to become totally magnificent. If you apply these principles of the 5 principles for success, our keys to an achievable outcome, and the well-formedness conditions, and you put these all together every time you set goals for yourself or for your clients, you'll have an absolutely unbeatable set of ways to set goals. Now, we talk a little bit more about this in The Secret of Creating Your Future, but this is really good as a starter. So if you haven't finished writing your goals, or if your goals weren't as well formed as they could be, taking this knowledge, why don't you go back and rewrite them? This is the end of program number 2. And we thank you for listening, and come on back and join us for number 3, which is next.